Okay, yeah, that's understandably we have a slightly smaller attendance than usual tonight, which I kind of predicted. I know it's a holiday week, but we're not supposed to be traveling, are we? But
Yeah, you're supposed to be home.
yeah, right. So the thing is, tonight's lecture is on Gothic architecture, and I sent you all an email. I hope you've seen it, which was that there will be at least one question on the final from tonight's lecture, either in the slide essay part, which is the most likely, or possibly the slide identification section, maybe both. Because Gothic architecture is an important topic, and that's why we're seeing, you see on the syllabus 3 weeks total on this subject, although the last and third lecture, from tonight, the last new lecture before the final isn't on architecture, it's on painting and sculpture of the late Middle Ages. So I'm going to define all this in a few minutes, but first a couple of quick announcements. I got most of your papers. They look pretty good so far. I haven't had a chance to grade more than a few of them. But I did need to mention two things. First of all, a few people, I think it's only like 3 or 4, sent me their papers through Outlook. Now, normally that wouldn't have been a problem, but lately, some of you may know this, I don't know if it's not something students have been apprised of, but we were told there's some kind of new, tighter security system through Outlook, at least at this JC. Oh yeah, we got someone in the waiting room. And the bottom line on that, what that has to do with your papers is, I couldn't open some of them. Some of them were absolutely blocked. I could see your email, but I couldn't open from Outlook. And then it had a pink box with black lettering and ominous sounding, exclamation points, and sort of like a, Trump tweet, right? A warning, this is an unsecured personal account. You guys are all students. You all enrolled online, right? Well, maybe you didn't. I know some of you. I don't know what the reason is. It doesn't matter. The point is, to cut to the chase, I won't be able to grade your papers if you did send them to me on Outlook. You'll need to resend them as, of course, PDF, as all documents should be, to my AOL account. And I, of course, conscientiously have responded to each of those emails that I couldn't open or that my readers couldn't. I think it's only 3 or 4 so far. Okay, so that's one thing. That it wasn't in my email that I sent, because I didn't know that till today, when I got a response from one of my readers saying she couldn't see the files, and then I tried to open them and had the same problem from just a few students. So please, always, every assignment, every bit of extra credit, and obviously the final, please make sure you send. I will remind everyone at least 1 or 2 more times before the final. Send everything to AOL. I know it sounds funny because people think AOL is an outdated system, but it's a lot less cumbersome than Outlook in my experience. Anyway, the point is, I couldn't see those that were sent through Outlook. Not good for your grade if I can't even read your papers after all your hard work. Okay, second is, I think I've got about 10 or 12 students who haven't yet sent me their papers. That's not a big disaster. I sent you an email that I did remind those who haven't yet. If you can get them into me before Saturday, that was the deadline of this coming week, then it'll only be 5 points off, because anything less than 1 week late does, of course, therefore only get a 5-point reduction for lateness. Anything after that, it's 10. And that's the same with the first paper. I still haven't gotten 3 or 4 people's first papers. So those people really want to get cracking. As my father and uncle in the Midwest used to say, you got to get cracking, guys. That means you don't want to wait another 2 weeks to do both papers and start studying for the final. Not a good situation to back yourself into a corner like that. And then the last bit of information, I've said it several times, but I understand it's a distracting time we're living through. The final's not cumulative, so you don't have to worry about everything you studied. You can just totally ignore it from before the midterm. It's only everything we've covered after the midterm exam. Okay, so I will also repeat that again, probably in an email. And that will be actually, I think it's Tuesday. No, yeah, it is. It's my birthday. I always end up giving a final on my birthday. I'd rather be doing anything else, but that's the schedule. December 15th is my birthday. So that night, it'll be just the test, and we'll be done early. and then I'll post it like I did before. But there is an absolute cutoff because I absolutely have to start grading them the weekend after that. So I won't leave it posted till Sunday like I did before. It'll just be till, say, Saturday, which if I do the math is the 19th. And then I have to get the grades done before Christmas, submitted. In fact, well before Christmas. I think it's like the 22nd or something. So I can't take extra credit after the exam, after the final exam. So if you're thinking of doing extra credit, for now, this will be our last new announcement, and then I'll just see if there are any questions before we start tonight's topic. Any extra credit options? No one's maxed your extra credit out, so some of you may think you don't need it, and maybe that's correct. But if you want to take advantage of it, you have 3 weeks between now and the actual date of the final. I can't accept extra credit after, well, let's say the end of the final exam week, which is Friday, actually. That would be the 15th, is the 18th, I guess. That gives me just a few days to add up, to grade the test and add all the scores and calculate your grades, including extra credit. Okay, that's the primary set of announcements for tonight. Anybody have any questions about anything I just said or about the extra credit options or anything else relating to your papers or the final? Because it's still early. I mean, the final 3 weeks from now, so we'll have time to talk about, like we did before, cut the list of study slides way down by 40 or 50%. Actually, it's already shorter than it was before. You notice we're only doing 6 slides a week. So tonight, unless anyone objects, hopefully it's unanimous, we can do what we've been doing for the remaining 3 weeks. That is, just go ahead without a break and keep going until we finish. And that way we can finish before 9 o'clock and not have to end at 9:45 or so. That worked well before, so nobody objects, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, any questions, anybody, about anything I've just mentioned relating to grades, papers, late work, extra credit? Okay, so let's shift gears. Now you're going to get to see some artwork that my father had a phrase. He was a full-time commercial artist, so that's interesting. I think someone's camera's facing the ceiling in their room. Okay, so let's get my thumbnail here further out towards the edge so you don't have to see it. That's as far as I'll go for now. Okay, I have been doing drawings, you've noticed that, and they aren't exactly artistic quality, but they're adequate. I'm going to have a confession here. My father would call this Mickey Mouse artwork. I don't know where he got that phrase, probably from watching Mickey Mouse cartoons when he was growing up. Anyway, the point is, I had to do this 6 times. Actually, I think this is my 7th version. I usually can do it on a board, a whiteboard in a classroom, much easier. Maybe it's the size of the surface that I can work with. Plus, you could erase them and start over if they don't work. So I had to do these over and over. So here I'm going to hold this up and keep it up for several minutes. Well, a few minutes anyway. So you guys can see it. And if you want to copy or take a screenshot. This is going to be helpful to some of you because tonight's lecture is focused almost entirely on slides with these features. These are the 5 main features of Gothic churches. It's on your syllabus, but here they are illustrated in my rather amateurish hand. You can see that, the windows are a little bit off, from each other, but at least I got the tower straight. It was crooked on the first 3 or 4 versions. But this is an important thing, all silliness aside. That the 5 main features are not something you're going to be asked to regurgitate, you know what I mean, verbatim, all 5, but you could be asked to remember, say, 2 of them on the true false, or something about 1 or more of these features on the final. So you should know these features, and we're going to cover them, of course, through illustrations from each of the slides tonight. So Gothic churches, not just cathedrals, but any Gothic style church, always had a tall and usually tapering. Sometimes they were just square towers, but they always had tall towers and almost always a tapering spire at the top. That's why I do the arrow where it is. You're going to see that even in Notre Dame, which is in Paris, and which is, some of you may have noticed, besides the fact that it nearly burned down, did have a spire which collapsed from the heat. It was behind the main tower. So even churches with square front towers and, in the entryway or above the entrance, usually somewhere they have a spire. So tall tapering towers, with a spire. I actually went to write that out, but it wasn't enough room. That's usually combined. The tower then ends in a pointed spire or tapering spire. Okay. Second thing is pointed arch windows. Not all, but almost all the doors and windows, and in many Gothic churches, all the doors and windows have these pointed arches. Then there's always a large round stained glass window right above the main doors, a few feet above the top of each of the main doorways. It's always in the middle on the front or facade. Sometimes it's on the side as well. You're going to see those tonight. I have some really nice slides of my own that I took of the rose windows at Notre Dame, which luckily did not get damaged. It's amazing in that fire. So that's what a rose window is. And of course, that would be the largest stained glass window in any church. And then the flying buttresses will bear some explanation. Let me let in these other people. I'm going to take this down. We have at least one more person to admit. Okay, I'll hold it up again in case you just joined us or couldn't see it all the way. Yeah, I think this is an adequate drawing. I mean, it's not tilting. A flying buttress is something that when I was growing up, we had a TV show. Some of you know his name, Ed Sullivan. He's the one who introduced Elvis Presley, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, every major, rock and roll act and performer of the 50s and 60s. He was the most popular TV show for decades, I think like 30 years. Anyway, that show used to have a group of acrobats called the Flying Bandito or something brothers, and then a rock and roll band, some of you may have heard it, called the Flying Burrito Brothers, came along in the 60s and 70s, riffing off that. So this has nothing to do with acrobatic acts, and yet in a way it does. You see the point at the bottom where the arrow is pointing to. A flying buttress is something that bears a little demonstration, and I'm going to do it with my own body. Now, that doesn't sound odd. Nothing in this class has. So I promise you that there's nothing here that's going to make you cringe. At least I hope not. I'm going to stand next to my wall, and let's see now. I think I might have to adjust. Yeah, I guess I do. Oh, no, there it is. What am I saying? Everything's reversed, as you all know from watching these screens for all these weeks. I can do this in a classroom much more easily, but I'll do it here for you. I'm going to demonstrate how a flying buttress works. Hopefully this is at least a little more clarification or clarity on what a flying buttress is and how is it different than any other kind of buttress. The word buttress just means support. Obviously that can take different meanings, to buttress someone's ego, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen a lot of that in the last 4 years. Anyway, the point is having a flying buttress on a church is a unique idea. So here's how, now you should start taking notes. I'll go ahead and tell you that, which is the definition of Gothic architecture has these five features. Now, I didn't put the fifth one in because you have to be inside. That's called Gothic groin vaulting. You'll see plenty of slides of those, of groin vaulting with the Gothic points in the lecture. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But those four features visible on the exterior have to be used together. Why? Because Gothic architecture, in essence, is, well, it is an engineering revolution. It's a major advancement on construction of buildings with tall towers. Without this new style or method, it's even not just a style, it's actually an engineering technique of how to support very tall towers. There would have been no way that the churches in Europe that have, some of you know, a few of you been to Europe, I think, if I saw many bios, right? Well, you certainly have seen pictures in the movie film in towns with huge cathedral towers, right, above the rest of the city that are 800 years old, some of them, and as tall as 500 feet. You couldn't do that with Romanesque architecture. Remember, 300 feet was the limit. So what's the difference between Romanesque or any earlier style of architecture for a church and Gothic? In a nutshell, here's the difference. Before Gothic architecture, all the way since the Egyptian times, really, the buttresses, that is the support system along the walls, the outer walls, would be called clasping buttresses. I discussed this briefly last week, but it might not have been as obvious. I hope it will be more obvious now. So let's say that'd be like some giant, super strong person taking their whole body and lining it up against the wall from the heel of their shoes or their bottom of their feet to the top of their head and holding the wall up that way, helping to support the wall because, of course, obviously gravity would tend to make a structure like a wall collapse if it didn't have support after, many years. So clasping buttresses, in other words, are buttresses that line the entire surface of the wall they're attached to. What's the difference with the flying buttress? Completely different. It's a revolutionary idea that engineers in Europe came up with. We'll talk about who invented Gothic architecture in just a minute. As though a series of giants, very strong people, were lining that same church wall, or a different church actually, and instead of lining their body up against the wall from head to toe, they just stick their arms out and help support the weight of the, from the pressure of gravity, of course, pushing down and out. Gravity is always pushing everything on Earth down and out. That's the force of gravity, of course, the effect of it. So to counter that, you would have a series of people, every so many feet, strong people lining these walls with their arms outstretched. And then what happens? The pressure or stress, it's called in architecture, you can just say, the pressure from gravity would push out from the wall through that person's arms or each person's arm, down through their body, through their legs and their feet into the ground. It's a uniquely brilliant, actually, idea that no one had thought of before. Let's get this next to see Carla here. Okay, so if you miss what I just did, you can see it on the video I will post. Now, I had to admit, the last 2 weeks, I got so sidetracked on Friday by various things, family issues that needed attention with my daughter, etc. So I sometimes forget. So if you don't see my video from any of the remaining 3 lectures by 7 p.m. on Friday, try again 24 hours later. It'll be there. I promise. I didn't go past, I think it was 5 on Saturday to post the video, but I'll try to do it by Friday. If you missed the first few minutes, you might want to watch that part of this lecture if you just joined us. Okay. And then, of course, this was the handout, not handout, I meant hold up. There we go. Diagram that I was trying to make sure you might want to take a screenshot. I'll give you another 30 seconds and we'll get started with the first must-know slide. Okay, so see where the arrow is? The flying buttresses help support the weight of the tower and the walls above them, which frees up. The point is, why did they do this? For 2 reasons. Why did architects who created the first Gothic cathedrals or churches decide to use this new system of flying buttresses combined with pointed arches, and then in interiors, they would on the ceiling have these Gothic groin vaulting. I didn't write that on there because it's on your syllabus and we'll see them later. So those things combined had 2 purposes. One is to support, as I just mentioned, these tall towers, unusually tall, taller than any other structure ever built before that on Earth. In fact, these towers were the tallest human or man-made structures in the world until skyscrapers were invented in Chicago in the late 1800s and then spread to New York and everywhere else. They're an invention of American engineering from the late 1800s. So up until early skyscrapers, no one could make a structure as tall as a Gothic cathedral tower. The other reason, besides the tall towers, is to free up the walls. The walls become windows. Yeah, that's right. The walls become windows of glass. Of course, most windows are glass, but not all. The point is, you could call them walls of glass or walls of windows. That's a better way to say it. In other words, the stained glass windows, not just the rose window here, but these smaller ones all the way up, which also had a pointed arch. The rose window doesn't need to support weight. Why? Because of the flying buttresses and the interior support from inside on the ceiling of these Gothic groin vaults. Combining that frees up the function of the bottom portion of the wall. In other words, every part of the wall below the flying buttress, below where it attaches, is not going to have to support much weight. I mean, some, but most of the weight is carried by the flying buttresses down through like the arm of a giant, through their body, through their legs, and down into the ground. It's ingenious, and it's really literally a revolution in engineering. Okay, so let's get started with the first must-know slide, which we will do the screen share. So, okay. Let's get it full size. Okay. I'm going to assume everybody can see this unless, heaven forbid, there's a problem. All right, so this is the first must-know, very important slide. And I am going to say that tonight, more than usual, our slides is so important. I always tell you this, right? So you can make a notation if you want next to your notes or somewhere in the margin. They're so important, I'm not going to cut them. And this is one I'm not going to cut. It's the first Gothic church in the world. It's the interior of the first Gothic church. The title is, first must know now, Church of Saint Denis. The French would say Sant, S-A-I-N-T. Now, if you abbreviated that, you'd still get credit. Remember we talked about last week, the French often would put ST period, like the city of St. Louis. You know, the French founded St. Louis, right? And Illinois, my home state where I was born. That's a French name, right? The French were all over what now the Midwest back in the 16 and 1700s. So there's a lot of French heritage and French names there. So you can spell it either way. I'll spell it again, though, the way it is on the syllabus. Church of Saint, S-A-I-N-T, Denis, is the French would say. We'd say Denis, and that's D-E-N-I-S. Ambulatory. You've got to say that if you want to get credit, if this were to appear on the slide identification part of the, or the essay part of the final. Ambulatory means walkway. It's where you walk. I'll explain that, how that works in a minute. Ambulatory is A-M-B-U-L-A-T-O-R-Y. I'll spell it again. A-M-B-U-L-A. Bless you.
Sorry.
No, it may make anyone sneeze. A-M-B-U-L-A-T-O-R-Y. And these long multisyllable words, I hope this helps a few of you. It helped me when I was in UC Berkeley art history. Those number of slides I've told you several times were way more than we have here in Santa Rosa JC. Hundreds the students had to memorize, and I never liked that part of it because it should be the minimum of it should be. But yes, you will have to know how to spell this if you want credit. I just break it down into its syllables phonetically. A-M-B-U, B-U, La, L-A, Tori, T-O-R-Y. If that helps, great. If not, ignore it. France, the country. France is the location. The date's 1145. Why is this so important? I'm not cutting it from the study list for several reasons. Sorry, every so often I have to take a quick swig of caffeine to at least lubricate my throat, if nothing else. All right, let's get to the first fact about this that I just said, but I'll repeat it. So you should definitely be writing this now. This is the first Gothic church ever built. It's a view of the walkway, the word is ambulatory, and you can see how it curves if you follow the line of the walls. It's the walkway behind, you could just say at the back end of the church and keep it simple, but it's behind the altar. It's where the priests would, get ready with their incense or whatever, just prepare for their sermons, right? And so it's the back end of the church. Again, an ambulatory, and that's what we're looking at. It's just one side of it, is the walkway at the back end of a church. And in this case, it curves right at the back end. Behind, it curves around behind the altar. Okay, but that doesn't tell us much about what we're looking at, just what part of the church it is. So here are the Gothic features. The doors you can just see, and windows. This is actually not a door. You can't see the doors. Obviously, they're behind where the photographer was standing at this point. But all the windows in this church, I've been inside this church. It's a World Heritage Site on Unesco's World Heritage List. You could add that if you want. It's one of the facts because it might be easy to remember. It's that important, a site. Okay, so the windows all reach pointed arches. You can only barely see that they have points from the columns somewhat blocking them, but they're all pointed arched windows, and all the doors here. Well, there you can see the point arch right here. Okay, and then we have the Gothic groin vaulting. So let's go up close to that, and you can see that. Sorry, I meant to. It should be possible to pull that down. Actually, that's good enough. Yeah, that's right. I forgot. Now I do need. There we go. That is a pointed arch, as are the arches that are below these. But this is your groining. We covered this last week, if you recall, and if you weren't at the lecture or attending it, you need to watch that, the Romanesque architecture lecture, because there are groin vaults in Romanesque churches, but they're rounded arches that intersect every so many feet along the ceiling. There's really no other way to describe them. So that's what you're seeing here, is the groined Gothic, specifically pointed arches. Obviously, that's what that means. Gothic groin vaulting on the ceiling. That adds extra support. And then the flying buttresses, of course, you could only see them from the outside. But if you're wondering where they join the walls, it's just above the tops of these windows, between each of the windows. The main point here, now let's go up close to this. There, yeah, that's a good view to see. That's all there is to the wall. There's as much glass, and in some Gothic churches, more glass than there is stone in the bottom section of the walls. Again, if you just think for a moment about the earlier styles we've seen all the way through this class, starting with ancient Egypt, all the way through last week, even with Romanesque, that wasn't possible before. The walls would collapse. If you could even build a church, it wouldn't stay standing up because it needed more support. With clasping buttresses, that wouldn't be enough support because the tower above is so heavy, right? Pressing down and out, as all forces of gravity always do. So what you have here are these thin, relatively thin sections, right? Or narrow, if you per se, narrow sections of wall, and the flying buttresses attach right about here. And if you were standing on the outside, you could see them projecting out like the arms of a giant, right? Every, what, I don't know, 10 feet or so, maybe? You're going to see a slide of that as how it looks on the back end of Notre Dame in Paris. It's one of the most beautiful structures on earth. That's why a lot of people were in tears. I don't mind admitting that, when I heard that it was burning and they thought they couldn't save it. That would have been a real loss to the world. Luckily, we know they did, but it isn't open. If you go to Paris, you can't go inside it now. It'll probably be 10 or 15 years before they restore it enough to be safe for people to go inside. Anyway, so we have a flying buttresses in between each of the windows, which frees up the walls to be walls of glass or walls of windows. I would even write it one of those two ways. And then you have these columns. This is not essential to Gothic architecture, but you notice these here. Let's go back a step to the full view. Clustered, they're called columns. You don't have to write that because it's not one of the essential features, but when you do that, you put a bunch of columns close together. Again, you can see how that could help strengthen the walls themselves and therefore the support of the ceiling, which is itself pretty heavy, right? Because this is a lot of stone and brickwork up here, because these are bricks. The rest of the walls, everything else is stone, as are the columns. So these columns combined with the Gothic groin vaulting and the flying buttress on the outside and the pointed arch windows, all that put together creates the strongest method of support, architectural method of support ever invented up till that time, until the invention of skyscrapers. Okay, so the only other thing to say about it is, who was the architect who invented it? I think I said this last week. Most medieval churches, certainly medieval cathedrals, were all a development of, or what's the right word? They were supervised, if not designed. There we go. That's how to say it. That most Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals were supervised and often designed by the bishop that created that church or became their first bishop would design the church that he, and it would only been men, of course, it still is in the Catholic Church. Someday maybe they'll have female priests, but not yet. So that he, the bishop, would have chosen whatever style they chose. They would have then designed at least the main outlines of the building and then hired someone to fill in the details, a master master contractor or stonemason who was in essence an early form of engineer. The bishop would have to work with someone like that because they weren't trained as engineers, but they did know how to design various styles of architecture. They were trained, most bishops, not all, but most, in that area of knowledge. So the bishop who designed this is a very important fact, and one of the last things to say on the meaning of this slide. His name was Bishop Suger, almost like the word sugar, but spelled S-U-G-E-R. He's a famous person in Europe. Most Americans have never heard of him unless you go to this church or you study the class like this. Him. He is often considered the father of or inventor of Gothic architecture because he designed this church. And this one, he did design it, absolutely. He actually designed the details and everything. Then he turned it over to someone, of course, to supervise. So Bishop Suger, I'll spell it again, S-U-G-E-R, is the inventor of, you could say, or you could even say father of, that's how they used to say it, of Gothic architecture, because he designed the first Gothic church, and here it is, it's still standing intact in a suburb of Paris. It used to be a separate town that was miles from Paris, but now it's part of Greater Paris, right? So just say it's in a suburb of Paris and is open to the public as a functioning church. No longer cathedral. They, that happens. They move the bishop somewhere else. But when it was designed by him in the 1100s, it was a cathedral and he was the bishop. Okay, plenty on the meaning. Formal analysis. Warm on the brickwork and some of the stained glass, what you can see of it. Yeah, you can see some of the red. But most of the colors here, the floor, and certainly the columns and the walls themselves, the actual walls between the windows, that's all cool gray. So it's mostly cool colors with some warm. The textures are real here. Now there's some simulated texture here. You can see it. So you might want to say Carve Line creates a simulated texture of leaves on the capitals. Remember, that's always the word to use, but if you say top of the columns, it wouldn't take points off. But the capital or top of the column has some simulated texture, but that's minimal. Everything else you see here is the real rough texture of brick and stone, and of course, the real smooth texture of glass. The largest mass, oh, there's no debate here. It's the ceiling, because of all these pointed arches and the groin vaulting and all this brickwork and stonework combined. The second largest mass after the ceiling would be the floor. And then in this view, you would have to say it's the main walls, but barely, because the windows are part of the mass. I'd say they're the fourth largest. They're almost as much glass in each of these portions of the church wall as there is stone, but slightly more stone. So that'd be the third largest mass, the stone walls. Okay, it's dynamic on the pointed arches, obviously on the Gothic groin vaulting and on the pointed arched windows here. And everything else is stable, the floor, the columns, right, the walls themselves. There's the obvious rhythm of the repeated shapes of the columns, the vaulting, and the pointed arched doors and windows, lots of rhythm. The modeling is just the shadows created by the sun, of course, natural modeling. There is a carved line only visible on the columns, but mostly it's visual line along the archway of the windows and the vaulting. There's visual line, but there is painted. So there's all three kinds of line here. On the stained glass, that's all painted line. Okay, and then we have space. It's a long curved walkway with about 15 to 20 foot high ceilings. Just say something under 20 feet. In fact, it's more like 18. So just say slightly over 15 or under 20 foot high ceilings. And that isn't very high, because this is not the main aisle, the nave. This is not where the people sit and where the thousands of people have to fit in during church services. That's behind whoever took the photo, it's behind where they stood. We're looking at the back end. So this section of the church is a long curved walkway with about 15 to 20, you can say it that way, 15 to 20 foot high ceilings. I think they're like 18 or so. Okay, I think that's enough for this slide. Now let's move to the next one. This one has a high possibility. Now, the last one I said I won't cut from the study list, but I'm trying to be more specific for your sake, for future study purposes. This and one other exterior, which will be, I'll go ahead and give you a clue ahead of time, one of the last two slides we're going to see tonight, which is Notre Dame, the church we talked about now in Paris that nearly burned down. And this one, those two churches, I would make extra special thorough notes, of course, here tonight, but also study them very carefully, because one of those two, I'm not saying for sure, but the very high percentage of chance that either one of those will be on, not both, but one of them on the final. So this is our second must know, and it is Chartres Cathedral Facade. Chartres is a city in northern France. C-H-A-R-T-R-E-S. I'll say it again. C-H-A-R-T-R-E-S. One word, Chartres. We don't say the S, the French is silent. Chartres Cathedral Facade. I know it's corny, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to, for those few of you who might be helped by this. My aunt, my favorite aunt, she passed away, bless her soul, is from Indiana, used to mispronounce every foreign word she ever saw, but she knew her stuff. She knew her history, her art history. She studied in college, but she just couldn't pronounce foreign words like most people from Indiana. Anybody from Indiana, don't be insulted. I have half my family roots over there. Facade is how she would say this. The right way to say it is facade, of course. Facade. One more time. Chartres Cathedral, Facade, France, location, and the date 1260. Why is it so important? Because it's the second oldest there's several reasons. The first is that it's the second oldest Gothic cathedral ever designed. Now, why don't I just say ever built? Well, it's a little complicated because this church took longer to finish. All these churches took about a century. Very, very few were finished in under a century. But the Paris Cathedral, that is Notre Dame in Paris that we've been talking about, that was built in under 100 years. This took over 100. So guess what? They were in a race with each other. We kind of talked about this a little bit last week with the competition of the height of the towers of Romanesque churches, and I called it tower envy. Well, here it might be completion envy, although that, oh no, I won't go there. Anyway, the point is that to complete ahead of time your schedule, your budget, whatever, your time frame that you had planned would mean you might not, as a bishop, live to see the completion, because how many people lived to be even 100, let alone over 100 back then? Very few. Maybe, but most likely it was that you could say to yourself at the end of a long life, hopefully, well, at least I know I'm ahead of my competing, bishop over in the next city or the next region, and my church will be done before his. That isn't really the main reason. It's just that some cities had more wealth and some bishops had more resources. So it's really not as much a competition. It was partly, but it wasn't so much a conscious race between them. But sometimes it turned out that way. But some cities finished their churches faster than others. So Chartres was not a big city. It still isn't. It's about 75 miles from Paris. It's not one of the bigger cities in France. So they took over 100 years to build it. So it became, here's how to say it. I'll say it again. Now you should write this. It was the second Gothic cathedral ever designed and the third to be finished in the world. And that hopefully will be clear, if it isn't already, why the distinction. Because Notre Dame wasn't designed till after this was begun, but it was finished before. Okay, I think that should be clear. So let's take a closer look at why it's considered a masterpiece. This is also a UNESCO, you could just say UN, but the right word is UNESCO, the cultural organization of the United Nations. UNESCO, UNESCO World Heritage Site. Oh, this absolutely is. There are whole books and movies and documentaries about this cathedral. Guided tours in about 7 or 8 languages are given of this building every day, and they're well attended. I've been here twice, and neither time did I find myself thinking, why did I come here for, I joined some of those tours because depending on who gave them, they were quite fascinating. So here's what we have. You notice something already. I'm sure most of you have. There's something odd about the towers. They're not even, they're not symmetrical, or are they even the same height? Now, how did that happen? Was it deliberate? No, it's part of the meaning. These towers are asymmetrical because they were finished in different centuries and designed by different bishops. So the first part of the church of this cathedral of Chartres was designed by a bishop who consulted, and this is an important detail, with Bishop Suger, the one I just mentioned to you, the guy that was the father of or inventor of Gothic architecture. They were alive during the same period. So he probably took a long, carriage ride to Paris, or to, the suburb there outside of Paris. And that almost certainly he saw the other building being built. In any case, he consulted with Bishop Suger, one way or another, by letter or in person, on how to design this new style, because no one else had done it before Suger, of course. So this architect, this bishop, you can just say, was inspired by the example of the first Gothic church, Saint Denis. And so these are the features we've been talking about. There's a rose window. Look how huge. That's about 30 feet across. It's one of the largest rose windows in the world. I think it's more like 35 feet. You're going to see even bigger ones at Notre Dame in Paris. They're the largest in the world. But that's a huge stained glass window. So there's your rose window. It's supposed to look like an open rose petal, or a blossom, I should say. Here's your flying buttresses. It's hard to tell, but if you can see where the arrow is, that's open space. It may be shadowed, so it looks like maybe it's not open air, but it is. Now, this flying buttress is only a few feet, like maybe 8 feet, 10 feet out from the wall. Later on, they get 30 and 40 feet away from the wall. because they perfected, just like everything else. When it's new, they're experimenting and are not confident of this technology, because some of the church towers, I already said this before, and a few Gothic churches did too, but Romanesque ones especially, would collapse. The tower would collapse, and if people were inside at the time, it would kill them, of course. So this is an experimental early example of Gothic. So the flying buttresses don't project out as far, but they're there. These buttresses are all detached from the wall, except for that one arm of stone, I like to call it. So there's your flying buttresses, and here are your pointed arches. Go up close again. Doors and windows. Oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? It's part of the meaning. That's not pointed arched. Some of you may have noticed already, but now if you didn't write it, you should. Why? How did that happen? Because this started out as a Romanesque church. It was being designed first in the older style, and then a fire, really disastrous fire, hit, and only this section of the wall survived. So the bishop, when he designed the new church, or redesigned this as a Gothic church, you can write it either way, incorporated this section because he thought, well, why start all over? So he decided to make the doors Gothic, but these three windows are the only ones that are not Gothic. They're round arched. So those are Romanesque. That's the only detail that's not Gothic. Every other window all the way up both towers are clearly pointed, arched. And here's your tall tapering spires. Like, you don't need to have any explanation what that phrase, how it applies, to this. But then what about the two towers being different? Well, here's what happened. The church opened with just this tower and the roof completed, of course, obviously had to, up to here. And this was just empty sky. There was no tower on what to us, on our view, is the left side. For centuries, they just ran out of money, or the Black Death killed off the workers, too many workers. It's just one way or another. I don't know the reasons, and it doesn't matter. Just say for some reason, or possibly various reasons, the second cathedral tower, the one on the left, was not completed until 1516. Now, that is almost exactly 250, well, it's a little over 250 years later. And this tower, if it's not obvious, is much more ornate. You notice that? Look at how much more stonework and decorative carving, and there's even sculpture and gargoyles sticking out. This tower doesn't have gargoyles. It doesn't have carved decorative, some people call it filigree or whatever, but it's decorative stonework is all you have to say. It's just the functional pointed arches, right, and the tapering spire. So this is the older of the two towers. It should be obvious, but if it's not, you should write that. And you can tell because it's simpler. The later structure is in a given period or style, the more ornate it is. That seems to be human nature throughout the entire world. It's true in Asia. I've seen, pagodas in China, where the older ones are more simple and plain. The newer ones, more recent, like only 300 or 400 years old instead of 800, are more ornate. And it's true of Gothic architecture. It's true of Victorian houses, as some of you may know. Here in the Bay Area, you certainly can see that. If you look at the earliest Gold Rush era houses, they were Victorian. She was on the throne. That's what Victorian means. But they had no decoration. They were just functional. And then a little later, they started adding woodwork, and then eventually stone and plaster details and stained glass. And late Victorian architecture is really ornate, right? So just summarize it this way. Say that the tower on the left was finished 2.5 centuries. You can just say the early 1500s. If you want to write it, though, 1516, that should be easy to remember, but that's how long it took. Because the church didn't have the resources to complete the second tower until much later. And when that tower was finished, it was much more ornate because it was later in the Gothic era. That's plenty on the meaning here. Okay, so let us now do a formal analysis. This is an actually yellow color of stone. It doesn't look like that here. Let's go up close. It looks off-white. So if you say that, I'm not going to take points off. You have to judge, or analyze in the formal elements. When you're seeing a slide, by what you see. But I've stood in front of it. It's kind of a light yellowish stone. So that's actually a warm color, even though it doesn't look like that here. So you may say it appears to be a cool gray when in reality the stonework is actually a light yellow warm color. Then we have the rhythm, of course, all the pointed arched windows and the three doors. And then, of course, the rose window. And the two towers, even though they're not the same height, they are the same overall shape. They're tall, tapering spires on top of the base of each tower. And then we have the largest mass. I would say this is, even though that tower is taller by about 30 feet, um, this is wider and the walls are thicker. Remember, they were experimenting. They didn't trust this style totally yet in terms of supporting the weight of the, the tower itself and the building from collapsing, to keep it from collapsing. So this is usually what happens. The earlier towers, if there is a difference in the period of the two church towers, it doesn't happen that often. But when it does, the older one is the thicker, heavier one, and therefore the largest mass is the tower on the right. Then the tower on the left. It depends on where you count, but technically towers begin at the ground, right? So that's the largest mass from the foundation to the top of the spire. And then this is the second largest, the tower on the left. And then the largest mass would be the middle of the walls. It's called the facade. So you could just say the center section of the facade or exterior. Okay, and then the rhythm is dynamic versus stable. Well, that's obviously every window, even the Romanesque ones, right, which are curved. They're obviously all dynamic. The rose window clearly is dynamic, and I think it goes without saying the two spires tapering as they do to a point are both very dynamic. The only thing stable are the outer walls and the buttresses. Actually, here some buttresses are not stable. They have a very ornate curve to them with the arm reaching up 30 feet or something. But these are pretty stable near the wall like that. Okay, and then for space, okay, the real space. It's two towers, the tallest of which is slightly over 300, or nearly, just say nearly or about 300 feet. And this one is about 285 feet. So just say a little over 200. You can just keep it simple, say about 280 on the shorter tower, feet tall, of course, and around or nearly 300 feet tall on the tower on the left. The nave inside the ceiling, you say interior, main aisle, the right word, remember from last week, is nave. You should know that word. It probably come up on the final, right? The nave is about 110 feet tall inside. About where the arrow is where it ends. That's decorative. That's not structural. So the ceiling is actually right about here. Okay, and then the modeling is just the shadows from the sun. The line here is mostly visual line. There is carved line, but you can't see it in this slide. If it's on the exam, it'll be this view, not the close-up of it, of course, so you can see the whole thing. Is it balanced? Oh, no, that's a hard one. I would say you decide. If you think the wider tower weights it more towards the, right, and therefore it's unbalanced toward the right, I wouldn't argue with you, but this is taller. So maybe that visually, if not structurally, makes it look like it's unbalanced towards the left. You decide. But you can say it has a rough balance because it's two tall tapering towers, which of course then straddle the facade in the middle, which itself, that section, all of this is balanced. Okay, now, here's the next must know, and this is the inside of this church. So I'll read you that. The title of this, the third must know for tonight, is the nave. We were just talking about that word. That you do need to know it for the exam. N-A-V-E. One word, of course. Nave. Don't put a K in front of it. Changes the meaning entirely. N-A-V-E of Chart. I'll spell it again. C-H-A-R-T-R-E-S. Cathedral. And again, of course, this would be the same location and date as the last slide. France, 1260. So when the church opened, this is what the parishioners saw. Now, these folding chairs, I've covered it this last week when we looked at Romanesque nave. But if you weren't here then, or you forgot, or you didn't write that detail, you don't have to write this. But they didn't have seating, permanent seating in most medieval churches, Romanesque or Gothic. Cathedrals are small chapels. Very few of them had permanent seating. Some did, but most didn't. The upper classes often did, but in this church, it doesn't even appear to have any. I remember it's been many years, but I do remember inside the church, I didn't see any permanent seating, from the original opening of the church. So people had to bring their own seating. Perhaps they had some kind of wooden seating for the upper classes, the rich. That usually was the case, and they might have been removed for some reason. Splinters, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so what we have is nothing on the floor originally, nothing. Possibly there were a few pews, but just say probably the floor was bare. And so then you'd look up, and what would you see if you were standing here, and hopefully you brought something to sit on, because these are long, these churches in the Middle Ages, the Catholic bishops would give 2 and 3 hour sermons. Anyway, you see the rose window. Isn't that beautiful? Let's go up close. And here's your rounded Romanesque arches left over from the earlier portion of the church that burned. This section is the only surviving section of the older church. And here's your Gothic groin vaulting. You really can see it clearly on this slide. And then here's your pointed arches, and with your clustered, that is the right word. So here you can see them. They're pretty important part of the structure. So you should write that, clustered with an ed, of course, columns, which then, of course, in between each group of clustered columns, there are the Gothic pointed arches. And then the flying buttresses are from here. This is where they're, well, let's get a close up. The flying buttresses, the arm of the flying buttress would attach to the outer wall right there. And then it would have a fairly thick section of stone before the actual, buttress of the, arm is sticking out, right? So many feet, however many feet it would be, probably 10 or 12. And then the bottom section of the buttress would come down along, but detached from the outer wall along the side here. So those, each one of these, wherever you see the clustered columns grouped together, is where a flying buttress is attached to the wall. So there's like every 10 feet or so. And then look at the walls of windows, like I've been saying tonight a couple of times. You notice how that frees up the upper walls to allow, actually both the upper and lower walls for that matter, because if it's designed properly, then the support is entirely in the heavier, thicker stone sections between the windows, and of course the flying buttresses, as well as the groin vaulting, all put together, freeing up the walls above and below the buttresses. But it's even more noticeable below. If you walk along this aisle here, the side aisle, which there always is in every Christian church that has a nave, the main central aisle where the worshipers sit. The side aisles, of course, are essential to get back and forth between the front and back of the church. And along the side aisle, these windows are even wider and taller than these. So the same concept applies. These walls of windows or walls of glass, again, only made possible by the combination of those features that made Gothic architecture the engineering revolution that it was, which, as you can see here, all work together to create this unique artistic and architectural invention or creation. By the way, pointed arches, I didn't say this, I should have at the beginning. Bishop Suger, how did he get that idea? Probably from Crusaders. We don't know that, but probably from talking to Crusaders. And how did they get the idea? Well, they went to the Middle East. They went to the Holy Land, quote unquote, what's now Israel and Lebanon and Jordan and that whole area. When they invaded those areas to take them back, quote unquote, or away from the Arab rulers that were there, and occupied those areas for generations. I think it was 100 years. The Crusaders had, some of them had managed to wrest or take conquest, by conquest, part of the areas of what we call, the Holy Land is what they call it then, Israel and its neighbors. When they had that area, they, of course, would often travel, not just the Crusaders, but their, architects, engineers, military and other engineers, and they'd bring back the knowledge of pointed arches with them. But here's the important part about the difference. The Islamic architects never thought, the Muslim architects never thought to use the pointed arch windows or doors that they had invented on their mosques and other buildings for architectural structural purposes. That idea first occurred in France with Bishop Suger. So it's like adopting, cultural adoption, whatever you want to say, adaptation. The point is that the idea of the pointed arch definitely did not come from France, but the use of it for structural support did. Let me take 10 seconds here. Okay, So there isn't much more to say about the meaning here, but if it were on, I would say it will be, if this were to be on the final in the essay part, you would want to describe what a nave is. Remember, it's the large central aisle, or long, actually, I think I said, yes, long central aisle of a Christian church, which is this whole section here. You can't see the other side of it, obviously. It's off the edge of the slide. The long central aisle of a Christian church in which the worshipers sit facing the altar. Okay, formal analysis. Inside the stonework has pretty much of a cool patina, off white gray, well, actually mostly gray. And then we have the ceiling here. This looks warm too, I know, but it's hard to explain. The sun is hitting it, so it makes it look warm. But I'm going to give you flexibility. If you say it looked to you, if it's on the exam and you're analyzing the formal elements, I won't take points off if you see it differently. But it actually is cool grays color, the whole interior of the wall, of the stonework itself. Then the windows are a mixture of warm and cool colors on the stained glass. We have the rhythm of the Gothic groin vaults, of the pointed arches, of the clustered columns, and of the stained glass windows. Plenty of rhythm. Of course, it's dynamic on the pointed arches, the groin vaulting, the rose window, and the stained glass windows, all of which reach points. Here it looks like it's round, but that's just because of the way the ceiling is here. So the pointed arch tops of all the doors and windows except these three, right? These are the doors here we saw from the outside. So almost every opening door window has a pointed arch, but in any case, all of them are dynamic, not stable. The only thing stable, of course, are the outer walls and the columns. The largest mass, again, that'd be the ceiling because of all the stonework supporting the weight of the ceiling. And then we have the floor would be the second largest mass. And then it's a close call between the outer walls because they're broken up by the stained glass. So it's however you see it. You could say the clustered columns and arches, or the inner wall, because this is like the inner wall, obviously. There's the outer wall there. So you could say the inner wall and then the outer wall. I think that's the simplest way to write about it. And there's no technique for modeling, of course. Here it's the shadows, quite a few of them from the sunlight. There's the visual line around the edges of the arches and painted line on the stained glass. Here you don't see much carved line, although technically speaking there is some, right? So if you want to write that there is indeed the third kind of line, only at the tops of the columns in this slide. You could add that. For space, it's a long, narrow aisle or nave with two smaller side aisles. And the ceiling reaches a height of about 110 feet. You're going to see some that are amazingly tall in the last few slides. I'm going to give you guys a break on note taking as we get to the second half of the slides, where you can, I'll tell you in just a moment, you can just look at my own slides of Notre Dame, where you don't need to take more notes, but we're going to do at least one more must know before we get to that. We're still going to end quite early, I'm sure before 9. Okay, I think I covered everything, right? Mass. Oh, balance. Oh, totally. This inside the nave is completely symmetrical, left to right. And I would say top to bottom because, you know, the same width applies to the ceiling and the floor, obviously. Okay, here's Notre Dame. This is one that's one of the two. I said the other was the exterior shot of Chartres. And then this is the other or second one. That is so important that definitely not only will not be cut, but has a high possibility or probability of being one of those two on the final. So you do want to take thorough notes. This is Notre Dame Cathedral. Now I happen to put it at the end of my list on tonight's syllabus, week 15. Notre Dame is French for Our Lady. And of course, it's also the name of a famous football school. I don't follow college football. I was at UC Berkeley when the Bears were losing every game they played, so I never even went to one game. I know it's terrible, right? And they did go to the Rose Bowl once. I remember that. Not while I was a student, anyway. Okay, so it's some of you heard of Notre Dame. It's in Indiana, actually, but it's named after the same person, which is Mary, mother of Jesus. If you're curious, that's what Notre Dame is. The word in French implies Mary, the Virgin Mary, of fame of being Jesus's mother, of course. So Notre Dame, I'll spell those two words, N-O-T-R-E, and then second word, D-A-M-E, Cathedral, Notre Dame Cathedral, of course, Paris, 1250. Now you see how it was finished 10 years earlier. Now you can see that if you didn't notice it before in the syllabus, than the completion date of Chartres. This, though, was finished with all the details at the time it opened, with one exception, and that was the tall tapering spire that was added hundreds of years later. So everything else in this photo, everything you see was originally just like it looked the day the church opened in 1250 or was completed for worship purposes. It's one of the most famous churches on earth, of course. And this is also voted. Actually, this is a fact you could add, that this is voted by people around. We talked about this with the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal is usually at, if not at or near the top of every list ever taken, and there are polls taken around the world, I think every year, several times, different organizations. The UN does some. The Pew Research are well-respected, independent, has nothing to do with politics. They don't take polls on politics. They take surveys about people's attitudes and cultural norms and so on. In any world survey, just keep it simple, this church is always in the top 10 of all world sites for most beloved structures. That's why so many people were so saddened when it was nearly destroyed. And so, why? It's considered the most perfect example of French Gothic architecture. After all, they invented Gothic architecture. Plus, it is the third, these are all the facts now about the meaning, that this is the third Gothic church ever designed and the second ever completed. I'll say it again. The third Gothic church ever to be designed and the second ever to be completed in the world. And it set let's say the style, you're going to say it that way, set the style or set the features for almost all French Gothic cathedrals for hundreds of years after that. You notice these towers are squared and they're symmetrical, or some would say twin towers. Well, there's a little bit of a visual trick involved in this. There are two, actually, and I'll see if anyone can guess in a minute. But first, let's just say it appears to be the two towers identical, therefore twin towers, right? Is not to confuse those with the ones in New York, but the idea of symmetrical and totally, identical, right? Bilateral symmetry, left to right. Gothic church with two identical towers is a French idea. And it was copied all over the world. I mean, some of you, Grace Cathedral, right? San Francisco, top of Nob Hill. That church is almost exactly this style, only much less ornate and, of course, a lot less old. It's from the 1920s, I think. Anyway, so this set the style for the rest of just say most, not all, but most Gothic cathedrals throughout the rest of France for centuries, because it was so pleasing to the eye of most people who came to see it. All right, why? Because it's symmetrical and because it has a lot of decorative detail, but the ornaments are somewhat in, what's the word, harmony. There we go. That's the right phrase. In harmony with the overall shape of the church, of the facade. Again, the word facade, good one to know, the exterior, right? So, for instance, these three pointed arches have a symbolic meaning. This is part of the meaning of this slide that I didn't give you on the only other exterior we saw was Chartres. But all Gothic cathedrals have this feature. It's called the tri-portal. Let's go up close. It's when you can see, yeah, there we go. This is my own slide I took in the winter. Gosh, it must have been 1998 or 99. So what you see here are the pointed arches that all the doors and windows on this church, there's nothing Romanesque here, have. But there's one slight difference. I think you can all see it now with the close-up here. I hope so. Anybody want to identify what's different about one of the doors? Well, look at all the detail of the arches, and then you see one that's not the same as the other two. Okay.
Oh, the one in the middle.
Yeah, this one here.
That one, yeah. Oh.
Yeah. That has an extra arch above it. It's just the bishop playing around with our vision or our perception. It's a slight visual trick. That's how I like to write it. You can write it however you want, but some phrase like that, that the designer, i.e. the bishop who was the architect that designed it, was playing on viewers or visitors to this church. He just wanted to make two things that weren't obvious at first glance, that were not the same as the others. So what about the towers? The same thing applies to the towers. Can anybody, I'll give you a close up here. Let's see. See anything slightly different between the two towers? I'm giving you a clue. Is there any difference?
No, I was just checking. Oh, the arches look different on the top. I don't know.
Actually, you know what? That's interesting. It wasn't what I was thinking or the way I would put it, but that is true. But it's true because of something that is different about, so you're on the right track. Excellent comment. But it is also something broad, bigger. Oops, I'm giving you a clue. Broader than that. Why are those arches different? You're right.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Because of I'm giving you a hint now with the way I'm moving my cursor here. It's wider by 2 feet. Yeah. The tower. So you got the idea, right? But now you should write that. It's another optical illusion or trick that the architect is playing on us, because most people never notice it. All the years I used to go to this church, I never noticed that until one of my friends who lived in Paris, a molecular geneticist, I can never say that, who's still living in Paris, actually originally one of the refuseniks Soviet Jews who left the Soviet Union because they couldn't get a good career when they were in Russia, and moved to France and stayed there. She told me that. She said, oh, I learned this from somebody, some professor at the university in Paris where she teaches now. So I wouldn't have noticed it. And I'm an architectural historian. It's very subtle. So that's how to write. This is a very subtle or minor difference in the width, but 2 feet is not actually that small a difference, is it? So you were right, exactly, about the width of these arches, of these pointed arches. They're wider here than they are, because they would have to be, because the tower is wider and this one is 2 feet narrower. So they aren't identical, but everyone, when you look at this, you don't think about that. You just call it, it's called outline symmetry or silhouette symmetry, meaning the outer shape of the building is clearly balanced or symmetrical, of course. The placement of the doors and windows are completely symmetrical. One big arch in the middle. These two arches are the same size and height. It's just that this one reaches an extra few feet, because of that little decorative detail above the actual arch. And then this obviously symmetrical detail everywhere else. And there's your rose window. By the way, the rose windows at this cathedral are the largest in the world. These are about the same as Chartres, about 35 feet. You'd think that'd be big enough. The ones on the side, there are two, one on each side. I'll show you the views inside, and you won't have to take notes on those. Those are 40 feet. So you could just say now in your notes, the largest rose windows in the world are included in the walls of this church on either side of this church, and they are 40 feet across. That's a massive amount of stained glass. Amazing they weren't damaged in that fire. I'm just that had to be a minor miracle right there. Okay, so then we see why it's Gothic, because of course you've got your rose window, you've got your pointed arches. What you can't see here are the flying buttresses, but they're there. They actually attach right here, and you're going to see them in my own slides. So just for now, we don't, you won't need to take notes when I show you those slides. But for now, add that to your notes. This has very protruding is the right word. Extended, you can say it either way, or protruding row of rows, it's plural, protruding or extended rows of flying buttresses. By the time this church was designed, the style had had enough, trial and error experiment, right, in the first two churches designed by Bishop Suger, right, we covered in the one in Chartres, that this bishop was more confident of the style he was using. And so they could manage to use, much more elegant and delicate even. I mean, this is a massive building, but it doesn't feel that way. Just like with the Taj Mahal in many ways. That, not that they look alike, but the concept of a building being heavier and looking lighter, or the other way around, I should say, looking much lighter than it really is because of the architectural design, is a common feature in this and many other French Gothic cathedrals. But this is the first one to make that conscious effort where the architect is trying to make the effect of it feeling lighter or looking lighter than it really is. Of course, it's massive. I mean, just the lead on the roof that melted, right, in that fire because it was so hot, weighs tons and tons. Just that on the surface on top of the roof. So it's amazing that didn't collapse either. Okay, so let's talk about one last thing. You see these figures here in the meaning, then we'll do a formal analysis, and then you can take a break from note-taking for just a few slides. I think you'll agree that this church, walking around it, is an experience that everyone, if you're interested in any of this, for your own future travels, and you do go to Paris, even if you can't go inside, take the time to walk all the way around this church along the riverbank or the footbridges that connect it to the main shorelines on either side. It's in the middle of a river. I'm saying it's on an island in the middle of a river. Some of you know this. The oldest part of Paris is an island where this church was built, and then the city expanded outward from there. It's a breathtaking view. You'll see what I mean in my slides. Okay, so let's finish up the meaning on this slide. See these here? These are statues of former prophets from the Bible. You can just say holy figures, keep it simple. Men and women, both. Holy figures, prophets is the technical word, but you can just say holy figures from the Bible, and mixed together now, earlier kings of France. Why would they do that? To do both side by side? We're going to get to that after we finish this slide and take a brief side trip with my slides, and then we'll have two more must-knows. We're still going to end quite early. So just keep it simple now, and then that'll be the last thing you need to write about the meaning of this, that above the doors here, like with all French Gothic cathedrals, and actually now most Gothic churches after this, even in England or Germany or other parts of Europe, but all French Gothic cathedrals had rows of sculpture of life-size figures or slightly larger than life-size. It doesn't matter which. You could just say about life-size, of two types of figures. Figures from the early prophets. If you say saints, that's not quite correct, but I won't take points off. It's almost like that. But early figures, holy figures, there we go, from the Bible, and intermingled with earlier rulers or kings of France. They were trying to make a political statement. Some of you can guess what it is, but for now, we'll just leave it at that. We'll just say that's what you see here as the last detail you should add to your notes on the meaning. Okay, formal analysis. This is an off-white color. Maybe you can guess some of you what was going on. See the scaffolding? They were cleaning it. Paris is metropolitan. Paris is about the same size as metropolitan Chicago, about 10 million people. That's a mega city. And there's lots of cars, and they're a lot less polluting maybe than some parts of our country, but they still cause pollution. And so they have to clean this church about every 10 years. They have to clean the facade. So that's what's happening. That's not the actual color. This is the off-white or light, sort of grayish white. It's definitely not warm. It's cool. And then it has a rough balance because we now know that it's technically weighted slightly to the left in our view of it here. The tower on the left is wider. Otherwise, everything below the top part of the towers is totally symmetrical. So it's really roughly balanced. You can call it outline symmetry if you want, but you can just say roughly balanced left to right. And of course, unbalanced are weighted toward the bottom because that's empty space here, right? All right, and then we have the rhythm of the pointed arches, of course, and the three doors, the tri-portal. Oh, I didn't say what that symbolizes. I apologize, you guys. Sorry, I meant to say you should put this back in the section where if you wrote that, if you didn't, now you can just add this. It is a fact about the meaning, and if you don't use it on the exam, you still can get full credit. But it isn't a minor point. And if you're Catholic or ever know anyone who was, you might know this. The three doors, why did they do that? All Catholic cathedrals did this to symbolize the holiest figures to the Catholic Church, which is not the Pope. Don't write that. The three holiest figures to the Catholic Church, in their view, are God, Jesus, the Son of God, supposedly, and the Holy Spirit. Don't ask me what the Holy Spirit is. You don't need to know unless you care to check that out. That's getting too detailed. But if you know from your own upbringing, maybe you do. So again, those symbolize the three doors, or tri-portals are called, of all Catholic cathedrals, Gothic or otherwise, but especially Gothic cathedrals. There are always three doors because they symbolize the three holiest figures to the Catholic Church. God, you could say God the Father, because that's how they'd say it, his son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit that's supposed to pass back and forth between earth and heaven. But you could just say the Holy Spirit is the third one. Okay, so that, of course, those are dynamic, as are the rose windows. And if you can't see them here, you could just say the flying buttresses project out at an angle. Of course, they're not straight. They're not at a right angle. Flying buttresses are almost always at a diagonal. So they are dynamic as well. And then the main walls and the two towers, the outer shape of them, of course, are stable. There's no obvious modeling except for the shadows here. It was almost noon, as I recall, on a foggy day. But when the sun shines, there's only natural modeling, of course, from the sunlight. And then we have carved line on these statues and on the doors. And even on the towers, you can see carved line here, right? And then visual line around the outer edges of all the arches, doors, and windows. And then let's see, the largest mass, that would be this tower by 2 feet, just a slightly larger mass or slightly wider tower is the one on the left. So that'd be the largest mass. Remember, the tower is technically every part of this structure down to the ground. Then the tower on the second largest, of course, would be the tower on the right, and then the central or middle facade section. Okay, let's see. Are we forgetting anything? Balance. Oh, space. Oh, that's kind of important. These two towers are 220 feet tall. 220 feet tall. The two towers are 220. There's your alliteration for tonight. And so they're equal height. And the nave is about 140 feet. That's a pretty tall nave, but they're taller ones. You're going to see them in the last few slides tonight. In fact, we're going to see the inside of this church in just a moment. All right, am I forgetting anything? I think carved line, balance, rhythm, stable, dynamic, yeah. Oh, texture, sorry. Real texture here on the smooth texture of the glass, of course, in the windows, and the rough texture of the stone in the walls. Now, you could say there's simulated texture if you want to get really technically correct in more detail. Yes, there is simulated texture on these sculptures, which is done with carved line. Okay, now you can rest your hands for a few minutes, and you'll see why so many people around the world consider this one of the 10 most beautiful buildings. I think it's the most beautiful church in terms of that. Well, of course, that would be a Christian house of worship anywhere. I've not seen anything more beautiful anywhere I've traveled. Here's the back end of it, and look at those flying buttresses. You see how far out they project? You see what I was saying? And look at the walls. That's not even 2/3. It's more like 3/4 of the width of the walls is glass. You see the point here, both above, right? I mean, at the height of the flying buttresses, and then down below on this level, and all the way down to the ground level. It's, you just say mostly walls of windows. Well, you're not writing notes now. You can just look and see this. Here's your tall tapering spire. We're going to talk about how that was added when I show you the full view from the riverfront, and you'll see the whole building in one slide. And then that's one of the two. You can't see the others hidden by this. That's where the ambulatory would be. If you were inside, you'd be walking around behind the altar in a curved walkway, and there would be your ambulatory. Of course, don't see it here. You will in one of my other slides in the interior photos. And there's all that lead that nearly collapsed the roof that melted during that fire they had. And they're replacing it with, I think, something less toxic than lead, as I recall. That's hundreds of years old, that lead there. Okay, so let's go take another look. Whoops, didn't need to do that. Now, where's the, oh yeah, right. There we go. There now you can see the spire. Now that was added, it's metal, and it was added hundreds of years later in the middle 1800s, middle 19th century. Again, you don't have to write that because I said you don't have to take notes. But for those who are curious why it looks different, it's a different material, and it was a different architect. Another bishop later on, who wasn't even the bishop of this church. He was a professor at a local university, but he had become a church official. And he designed the spire there, the one that melted in that fire. Whoops, whoa, let's go back. You see how, I mean, I don't know. If you see any movie ever filmed in Paris, and there's any kind of a love scene in, like at night, especially when this thing is lit up, every inch of it is lit up with beautifully soft colored lights. It's breathtaking. So there's your spire that was added by a later, just say architect, because he wasn't a practicing bishop, so you could say an architect. He's actually a professor of architecture at one of the universities, and was added in the mid 1800s, like 1850s. And then everything else is original. Look at these flying buttresses. You see what I mean about arms, like giant stone arms. And then here are the more closely attached buttresses, but you can see them here if you go up close. You see there, these help support the weight of the front part of the walls. These support the whole back half of the walls, which of course has on top of it the weight of this immensely heavy metal spire and the roof itself pressing down and out. And those buttresses did not fail either during the fire. Obviously, if they had, the whole thing would have collapsed. And then these two towers, they weren't damaged by the fire because it never made it to the front part of the church. And you don't have to have seen The Hunchback, right? My daughter used to love that, the Disney cartoon version. But if you don't already know, the best version, if it interests a few of you, of that whole story, which of course, Victor Hugo wrote a masterpiece when he wrote that novel, French author, of course, in the 1800s. The best version is the first. It's a black and white movie made right before World War II. A year later, they couldn't have made it because Hitler occupied Paris. 1939 with Charles Laughton, the most incredibly talented actor of his generation. If you think I'm exaggerating, sometime go on the internet and you'll see what I mean. He not only did he win a bunch of awards, international and of course Academy Awards here, he was British, but he moved to the US. He played Henry VIII, he played Rembrandt, and he played Quasimodo, right, the main character, of course, from The Hunchback. And in that movie where he played Quasimodo, he'll bring tears to your eyes. I guarantee it. If you watch the movie and pay attention, especially near the end. It's better even than the Disney cartoon, which is not bad for a Disney movie taken off or based on a novel. But you can see where the setting is. See, there's the river, right? The Seine, and there's the island where the city of Paris was founded by the Romans. It's actually an old Roman city. And then here you can really see the setting. Look at that. This was in January. I remember that. They hadn't had any, global warming was happening in the late 90s already, as some of you well know. Imagine it's about when many of you were born, right? I mean, it was happening and they were talking about it, but not here in this country. We weren't much. Some people, scientists were, but not too many political figures were. And soon we'll have a cabinet post based on trying to deal with it. That's a new development. You see there are the flying buttresses again, and there's your tall tapering spire and the nearly but not quite exactly twin identical, almost identical two towers. Yeah, I'd like to just, let you see how this just, it dominates the skyline of the center part of Paris. They don't allow any skyscrapers in Paris. Now, I'm from Chicago, the birthplace of skyscrapers, so I have nothing against them. But in a city this historic, this beautiful, this humanly scaled, a skyscraper would be, I don't like what happened to London. The skyline of London has become dominated by American influence architecture, specifically taller and more outrageously shaped skyscrapers. And I think it's kind of, that's not ruined the city by any means. It's still a wonderful city. I was in London not that many years ago, and they already had about a dozen. Now it's like twice that many skyscrapers. But you notice none here in the city of 10 million. The skyscrapers are kept in the suburbs. Okay, now let's go inside, and then we'll get to, don't forget, two more must-knows. This is the nave. Now, I was holding my camera steady as best I could between heartbeats because this is a 1/4. Yes, this is before digital photography. Definitely, it's in the 90s. 35 millimeter camera, and they don't allow tripods inside this church, so I couldn't do that. Now, when I first went in there, I was with my girlfriend who acted as a human tripod. She stood still, and I used the top of her head because she was only 5'1". I couldn't do that. I was here by myself this time. So I just had to hold the camera steady. So bear with me that it's not in perfect focus, but it's a good enough image for you to get an idea. Look at the Gothic groin vaulting. That's 140-foot tall ceiling. And look at these windows. We saw them from the outside, right? With beautiful stained glass. Okay, so now we'll take another view. Yeah, this is a little better because here you can see the ambulatory, which of course would be the walkway. You can't see the actual floor, but there's your altar. And here are these inner and outer walls right, which help support each other. But the outer wall is, again, not supported by the stonework. It's supported by the flying buttresses you just saw. And then you have here, these are thicker columns. They're not clustered. So here they aren't, but there they are on the upper portion of the wall. So let's go back to the main view, and you can see, look, that the color of that glass is, there's two churches that are considered the most beautiful, the most beautiful stained glass windows on earth, and those are Chartres. I did mention that before. I could have. It's one of the facts about the meeting, but you don't need to add that. Some people think there's no question Chartres windows are more beautiful. I disagree. I think these are, but they're both excellent. The color is why, because the color is so rich and deep and saturated into the glass, because you know what it is. It's literally stained or painted glass in essence. Okay, now we're going to see one more thing. This brought tears to my eyes, and it's not about any particular belief of certain types. I'm not going to get, religious here on you. Don't worry. I'm just going to say this is called, and it's not my phrase, the Chinese Madonna, by Chinese Christian groups who have toured this church for decades. From Taiwan and even mainland China, there are tens of millions of practicing Christians in China that is under the communist government. They don't like them. They oppress them. They try to keep them from going to church, but they do. I know, I've seen them. I've been in several parts of China. So some of them come here, on tours, either from the mainland, as in communist China, or from Taiwan. And I happened to be there the day a group of Taiwanese Christians in a tour bus got out, and their tour guide was speaking in English. I'm not sure why. Well, some back and forth between, I think it was Cantonese, right? The Southern Chinese, right, dialect. So I understood about half of what he said, but he was talking about how beautiful the face of this figure is. And that is Mary with baby Jesus, who actually looks like a baby. You see him? I mean, he actually looks like a normal, innocent little kid about, maybe 8 or 9 months, a year, being supported by his mother, who is standing in contrapposto, but we can't see that because of her robes. This is 200 years ahead of its time. And it's an amazing piece of sculpture. And yes, it survived that fire. Barely. The firemen had to rescue it by putting a tarp around it, which had been, it was in danger of cracking from the heat alone, let alone possibly falling off the pedestal. But it was saved, and it'll be put back in the church if it hasn't already. But she has certain Asian features. That's not my thinking or my perception. It's what it's often described as in different guidebooks. My neighbor next door is Taiwanese, and he's been here, and he's told this to me more than once. It's such a beautiful sight of a mother lovingly embracing her baby that it's universal. It isn't about any one religion or any particular lifestyle or whatever. It's just human kindness and tenderness. It's a masterpiece, and no one knows who designed it. 200 years before the Renaissance. It was an inspiration to people like some of the Renaissance sculptors. Okay, now back to must-knows. We're down to, we'll still be finishing quite early. We have 2 more, okay? And then I'll stick around. I always do after the last slide for those who have questions about anything, as long as you have any questions. Okay, this one is the second to the last must-know for tonight. It's the prophets and ancestors of Christ. And you may or may not know the spelling of prophets, and that's not with an P-R-O-F-I-T, that's a different kind of prophet. P-R-O-P-H-E-T-S, prophets, and ancestors, you probably know, but I'll spell it. A-N-C-E-S-T-O-R-S. Again, prophets and ancestors of Christ. Chartres, that's the same church. So 3 of these slides you notice. I'm not saying this one is so important I won't cut it. I might or might not. You just remember it could still be on the final study list. So for now, assume it's something you need to have notes, of course, thorough notes, and possibly to study for the final. Okay, Chartres, you probably already remember, but I'll spell it again. So here we didn't put the country, we put the town, okay, as the location. C-H-A-R-T-R-E-S, of course. 1155, well, if you do the math, that's decades before the church was finished. Well, it makes sense, because this is at ground level, or eye level, I should say, eye level. Was slightly above, okay, slightly above eye level. It's entry, there we go, that's the phrase, entry level. These are life-size figures. I already described this with these one set of figures. Remember the details across the middle of the facade above the doors of Notre Dame. But now you need to really write this, if this were to be on the exam. These figures, most of them are from the Bible, the early holy figures from the Old Testament. It's called, you don't have to write that. You can just say the early chapters or early part of the Bible. And they were holy men and women. You see some of them are, let's go up close. I mean, there's a woman, right? These are supposedly people who would have either become later on maybe saints, according to the Catholic Church, or they actually were ancestors literally related to Jesus, according to the Bible. Okay, but there's also rulers mingled in with them. And I think this guy here, for instance, he's wearing a crown, as is this one. So these figures could easily be, they could be kings of the ancient kingdom of Israel. They probably are, but they also were meant to double as images of earlier French kings. So why, I hinted at this, now you need to actually write this. Why did they do that in French Gothic churches, particularly cathedrals? Mingle or intermix or intermingle figures from the Bible. Most of the figures were directly taken from the Bible, with some images of earlier rulers of their own, the French kingdom, because they wanted, you could guess, some of you, to associate the political ruling class, right, in the minds of the worshipers as equally worthy of respect with the figures in the Bible. So in other words, it was a political piece of propaganda, or a piece of political propaganda. They were saying, the ruling classes, well, our ancestors, those who came before us to help, form or help expand, create the kingdom of France, should be looked on as just as important and as worthy of respect, if not worship. They wouldn't probably go that far, but maybe some of them did. Some people do. But the point is, mostly they were just saying we should be seen as equally worthy of respect, us, that is the ruling class, and our ancestors, in others, on the same level of respect with the figures in the Bible. So it's a piece of political propaganda. And often these figures doubled. They had more than one identity that some people, at least the educated people, would know. But these here are mostly, these four are early figures from Israel, right? That's the first part of the Bible describes, like King David, you've heard of him, some of you, right? Solomon, right? That's probably who these two are. But you have to know who they were. You can just say that they are, the primary identity of these figures is from the Bible, but some of them had a double identity, or double meaning, I should say, a double meaning, which was secondarily as images of the earlier rulers of France, because it was a political propaganda statement. Okay, the other thing is the style. I told you earlier about the Romanesque, right? You definitely, if you do see that lecture, you want to review it on, it's been posted for over a week now on YouTube. Romanesque sculpture is lively, lifelike, full of motion, dynamic. There are several ways to say it. In motion, not these figures. These figures are stiff and ramrod upright, aren't they? I almost would say lifeless, but that's a little too strong. This guy doesn't seem to have much liveliness. And this woman has a slight hint of maybe a little bit of a softness, possibly even almost the hint of a smile. But basically, they're standing stiff, upright. I would even say ramrod upright, but you can use whatever phrase you want. And certainly they're not lively and in motion. And we saw that with the jam. These are jam statues. Remember that. I didn't say that. I should have. Sorry, jam statue. Just like the one of we saw last week of the Romanesque figure, the prophet Jeremiah. But he was running. Remember, he was in motion, even though he was stuck to a column in a jam of a doorway, just like these figures. There was movement. There was liveliness and dynamic quality. And almost all Romanesque sculpture on churches did do that. And then for whatever reason, in the Gothic style here, we see they abandoned the lively poses and went back to stiff and because earlier medieval sculpture was like this too. I wouldn't quite say lifeless, but emotionless. There we go. Emotionless poses and expressions. They just decided not to try and, continue the style of the Romanesque sculpture. So it's what marks this as Gothic style. There are exceptions. We just saw the one at Notre Dame. That's not typical, though. And that wasn't a jam statue, of course, but it was a woman, a mother carrying a baby, stuck with her back along the back of a column, because they didn't know how to make freestanding sculpture. That comes back into use after the Renaissance. So this is well before that. So, okay, that's the whole meaning. The style, stiff formal Gothic style, and the political, symbolism, as well as the actual identities of these figures from the Bible. Okay, formal analysis, totally stable. The only things dynamic are their halos and the tops of their heads, but there is good symmetric texture on their clothing, done with carved line, and on their faces. Okay, and then the only technique for space is overlapping their clothes, overlapping their bodies, and they overlap the columns. They're slightly larger than life size, but you could say about life size. I've stood here, and my eyesight was, top of my head was about right here, just above their feet. So they're a little taller than, of course, in the Middle Ages, people were shorter. So you can say they're slightly larger than life size, and that's real space. But it's really, the techniques are only overlapping, is the only technique. Okay, and then we have the carved line. Of course, I already mentioned that. And then let's see, balance. Well, totally. There are 4 figures, 2 on each side, and each one of the sculptures is totally symmetrical, right? It's intact human bodies, of course, are by definition balanced. The rhythm is obvious with the faces, the eyes, and then the arms and legs, the folds in their robes, and the columns behind them. Textures simulated, right? I already mentioned, I think, on the clothing and the hair, but the real smooth texture of stone on the columns and real rough texture of wood on the doors. You can't really see the red. Well, yeah, you can here. You could get, but you only need to give 2 or 3 textures if this is on the essay part of the final. Okay, so you could add that. There's real rough stone on the walls, real rough wood on the doors, and similar textures on the figures and real smooth texture on the columns. The modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And the largest masses, well, the columns behind them, and then the human figures, or you could say the door, but we're talking about the sculptures, so we just focus on the stonework. So it would be the columns first and then the human figures. Really, that's enough, the 2 masses. Okay, let's finish up with something that might get across, I hope, if it isn't already clear in your minds, what is so remarkable about the Gothic groin vaulting that you could only see, of course, from the inside on the ceiling of these churches. So I'm going to give you the title, but I'm not going to show you the actual slide of it until there's 4 more slides, different views of this same church. And the only one that, if it's on the exam, you would have to remember will be the last slide, which is what we'll end with tonight. Okay, but the title of this last must-know tonight, Vaulted Ceiling of Amien Cathedral. And vaulted, you should remember from last week, but it's V-A-U-L-T-E-D. Ceiling, I think everyone knows, right? C-E-I-L-I-N-G. Of Amien is the city in France. A-M-I-E-N-S. A-M-I-E-N-S. Cathedral. France, the location, of course, the country, France, and the date 1288. So what's remarkable about this is one of the tallest, this is now the meaning, so you should start taking notes. This is one of the tallest naves in France, I think in all of Europe, for the ceiling height. Well, you could say that, period. You don't have to say it because of the ceiling height. It's self-explanatory, right? The nave has one of the tallest ceilings, or just say it is one of the tallest naves in all of Europe. And I think it's the tallest in France. It's about 160 feet. You could fit a 16-story skyscraper inside of this building. It would barely touch the ceiling. Here's your Gothic groin vaulting. But if it's on the exam, because this looks not that different, although it's a different angle than the interior chart, I'm going to show you a totally different view that'll make it clearly distinguished from the view of the nave and chart, in case either one's on the exam. But let's work our way up to it. See, walking along the side aisles, that's what these are here. Of course, we're looking, right, there's an arch there, and then we're standing behind, the row of clustered columns, right, on the side aisle. And the nave, there's the altar, so the nave goes off this way, right? Can't quite see the vaulted ceiling from here, but you begin to get the idea something's different about this church. Very, well, 2 things. One is the nave is one of the tallest in the world. You can just say it that way if you want. But it is the tallest in France. Yeah, I remember reading that. So it is the tallest in France and one of the tallest in the world. There are taller naves in Germany. Leave it to the Germans to want to outdo the French. Several of their cathedrals have even taller towers and taller ceilings. than any church in France or anywhere else in Europe. That's just the thing the Germans were into in the late Middle Ages, but we'll cover the German Gothic stuff next week. Okay, so what we're saying is about the meaning that you should be adding is that it's a difference, not just of the height, this church, from all other even French Gothic churches, or just say French Gothic churches. What's also different is the light. Look how light it is. You see that? The light is flooding in here. Why? Because they didn't have the money to finish all the windows with stained glass. Stained glass, beautiful as though it is, the colors it creates on the walls and things. Nonetheless, it's darker, of course, the interior because of the stained glass if it's in every window. Here they couldn't finish it. This one has stained glass. There's a color slide, by the way. and this is plain, you know, translucent glass with no colors, no staining, no paint, and no color to diffuse the light. So it's all the natural sunlight flooding in. So it's a much lighter interior. That's one of the other facts about the meaning. But now let's go see. There we have. This is the view it'll have if it's on the exam. See, only the back window has stained glass, the very back end of the church. And we're now in the nave on our back. I've done this many times, and I've gotten kicked out of more church. Canterbury Cathedral, and then Westminster Abbey in London, you know, where all the famous kings are buried and many of their poets. I just wanted the ceiling. So how else you can get the ceiling if you have no tripod and you're not allowed to bring a tripod? So you lie on your back and take the slide. But some people think that means you're disrupting the concentration of the tourists, of the other people around you. So I got kicked out of both churches. So be aware if you want to do that. You probably should ask first. I wasn't hurting anything, so nobody was upset. But I was told I couldn't continue to lie on the floor and take pictures like this. I had to take this photo. It's a professional photo. Someone had to have a tripod for this one. Look how beautifully focused it is and exposed. It's ideal. So here's the view if it's on the exam. This is your Gothic groin vaulting, 160 feet above the floor. Here are your clustered columns. Here are your Gothic arches. Here are your Gothic stained glass windows, and you can't see the flying buttresses because they're on the outside and they attach right about here. Yeah, in fact, they definitely do. I've seen this church from the outside, but I didn't get in it. It was closed when I was there. I really wanted to see it because I'd read about it. So anyway, here's your Gothic groin vaulting. Here's the immensely tall ceiling and the light flooding in because there's not as much stained glass in the back half of this church. Most of the windows have no stained glass at all. So formal analysis, this doesn't look like color slide. It is, but I'll just tell you it's cool gray color, except for the one stained glass window has some warm. The textures of the real smooth texture, rough texture of the stone on the walls and the ceiling, and real smooth texture of glass. The lines are painted on the stained glass, of course, and carved or visual. You can say, well, actually, they're both carved and then also visual on the pointed arches of the groin vaulting. And here they are mostly visual lines on the actual arches themselves. And the modeling is the shadows from the sun. Where there are shadows, you notice there aren't on this side very many. But here there is actually enough shadows to say there is modeling, natural though not technique-wise. For space, I already mentioned, I'll repeat it. So the ceiling is about 160 feet tall above the nave, which is itself a long, narrow central aisle, of course. It's dynamic on the pointed arches and the groin vaulting, stable on the walls. And then it's balanced, completely symmetrical, totally balanced. The largest mass, the ceiling, then the floor, and then the lower or first level of arches, because that's pretty massive stonework. And then the upper level is more glass. That's glass, by the way. It's not obvious all the way around. Then the fourth largest mass would be the upper walls. Dynamic, stable, balanced, rhythm, of course. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to do one last thing. I forgot I told you I'd show you stained glass windows. You don't have to take notes. I used to put this, and I will probably again in the future, on the syllabus. It's the largest rose window in the world inside Notre Dame. It's only visible, of course, when you're standing in the middle of the nave and looking at that arm that I told you is called the transept, the crossing, right? The part of the church at right angle to the nave. You have to stand there at the right time of day, and you don't need to take any artificial substance to get high. I mean, I saw people doing that while I stood there, but I got high just watching the sun filter through this set of beautifully colored glass, 40 feet wide and 40 feet tall. Of course, it's completely identical dimensions, obviously 40 feet by 40 feet, right, in a round stained glass. And then these are the smaller, regular pointed arch windows below, all of which survived the fires. But when the sunlight passes through at certain times of the day and hits the floor in front of your feet or the pews, which they had some in the front, or was it, no, that was the folding chairs, that's right, or wherever you're sitting, you know, or even your legs, right, when you're sitting in the middle of this section of the nave, and if the sun's coming directly through here at the right time of day, it's a magical experience to watch the colors change. And I stayed for an hour to do that. And then here's the detail. Here's Mary and baby Jesus, right? And here are various saints and prophets from the Bible, some of whom also are dressed like medieval French kings. And again, we know the reason for that now, but you don't have to take notes on. These are my own slides. I took all of these slides. And then this one. Actually, this one isn't. Yeah, this one is one that I had to pay for because the light wasn't coming through. It's the other side of the transept. It's the other rose window, opposite of the one I just took. Showed you, I mean, the photo of. Here the glass is more deeper, richer. See, purple colors. Look at that. Yeah, I meant to do that with the other one too, because there's just hardly anything like this in the world. So we'll just, here we go. You can see these colors are more bluish, you know, and off-white, right? And then I'll go ahead and do one. We only have two more. These are not must knows, but for those who find this interesting, you see more of the color here is the richer reds and things that are more common in most Gothic churches. The windows are more red and blue than anything else, and that's only true of some parts of Notre Dame. There's more variety of colors in it. That's why I prefer the windows here. And then look at this. Anybody see Monty Python, the cartoon version of history, where they have, you know, a funny voice or sound effects behind these cartoon-like figures? That's what I think of. And here's your reds and blues. These are the oldest windows meant to be. Those two colors were the dominant colors. It's just what they knew how to do. Then they expanded into the deeper, richer variety of purples and greens and golds and things. It's a peasant chopping, you know, wheat with a scythe, and he didn't look happy to me. Does he? Life was rough for peasants back then. They were slaves. I mean, that's what they were. They were called serfs. It's the same thing. It's a kind of slavery. You know, they had no freedom and no choice but to work the land and pay all of the profits to their masters, right? So it wasn't a good time to be poor or working class. But on the other hand, the beauty of the architecture is a separate issue. I mean, a separate function. Okay, that's the first slide for next week. So we are done for tonight, but I will now ask, are there any questions? So let's go back to that last view so you can see the stained glass window as we finish up tonight. Any questions about anything we covered tonight? If you joined us late, you know you can see what you missed. Either Friday or Saturday. It may be as late as Saturday before it gets posted on YouTube, but it will be. And of course, extra credit, you're now down to less than 3 weeks, well, about 3 weeks for you to use that option or those options. And then I will be grading the exams, not the exams, I misspoke, the second papers, and as will my readers, and I will log them in after I double check their work. Probably about a week from Thursday, or it could even be earlier. So not this coming week, because hey, it's Thanksgiving week. I hope you all take time off, relax, enjoy being with whoever it is you're with, hopefully safely, and enjoy the holiday, and just a little bit of you know, a break from all the stress that we've all had to deal with. And then be ready next week, exactly a week from tonight, to finish up with 2 more weeks of new material. And then the final week is, of course, the exam itself. We're going to review 2 weeks from tonight, so you want to be in that class session, so you know what is or isn't going to be on the exam. Just like with the midterm, I'm going to cut the list down by at least 40%, both the list of terms to know and the slide list, study list from the syllabus. And of course, your papers, if you have questions, well, you'll have them mostly explained to you when if you email, you have to email me for me to send you the grades. But if you didn't get your papers in, last reminder, well, second to last, you've got 2 more weeks to get either the second paper, if you did get it done. If you get it into me before Saturday, it's only 5 points off, or 10 after that, or the first paper. So if you didn't finish either one or both, you want to get busy. Okay, any questions from anybody about anything we've covered tonight, or extra credit or grades? All right, none? That's it? Okay, you can always email me, right? I will be checking my email, but not on Thursday. Okay. It's also my it's a wedding anniversary, my wife and I. So Saturday, I'm not going to resend. So Thursday and Saturday, I'm sorry, I won't get back to you in 24 hours. Friday and Sunday, I will check my email and I will respond easily within 24 hours, if not right away, to any questions by email, and confirm any extra credit options that you decide to send me. Okay, so one last call. Anybody have any questions that I didn't already answer that are on?
No.
Yeah, okay.
No.
Well, thank you. Well, I
Thank
hope
you.
you enjoyed seeing the
Thank
slides.
you so much.
Yeah, just for your own enjoyment at the end like this. And I will see you all 1 week from tonight. Have a great Thanksgiving and a safe one. Yeah, you guys.
You too. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, someone was wanting to admit. Oh no, is Ryan there? Nope. Sorry, I didn't see that because of the screen share. Okay, I'm sure he knows he can catch what he missed on the. Oh, Ryan, is that you? Did you have a question? All right, that's fine. You can check everything that you didn't see, of course, on YouTube by Saturday. All right. All right, I'm gonna now sign off here. Okay. Have a good holiday.